I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. The sound of my life being bartered away was not a crash of thunder, but the dry rustle of my father's papers and the thin, calculating clink of my stepmother's teacup against its saucer. They spoke of me not as Alara, their daughter and stepdaughter, but as a problematic piece of furniture that no longer fit the decor of their ambitions. An encumbrance, a quiet, plain, and therefore inconvenient truth in a house built on the glittering falsehood of my sister Clara's beauty. Something must be done about Alara, my stepmother, Lady Finch, had said, her voice the auditory equivalent of a pinched nerve. The Duke of Blackwood will be at the assembly on Saturday. It is imperative that Clara has no distractions. Alara's presence is a constant reminder of our reduced circumstances. She has the look of a poor relation, which she is. My father, a man whose spine had long ago dissolved into a puddle of indecision and claret, had merely sighed. What do you propose, my dear? We cannot simply lock her in her room. Do not be absurd, Henry. I propose your cousin, the vicar in Northumbria. He is a widower, is he not? He requires a housekeeper and a wife in that order of importance. Alara is proficient in household management. It is a perfect match of needs. She will be settled, and more importantly, she will be gone. I had stood in the hallway, my hand frozen on the handle of a porcelain pitcher filled with wilting lavender, and felt the world tilt on its axis. Not with shock, for I had never harbored illusions about my place in their world, but with a cold, clear finality. I was a problem to be solved, a ledger to be balanced. My own desires, my own small, fiercely guarded inner world were of no consequence. I was 22 years old, and my life, it seemed, was already over, destined to be a long gray postscript in someone else's story. While my sister Clara was a sonnet, praised for her perfect rhyme and meter, I was the marginalia. The faint pencil markings of a life lived in the shadows of another's brilliance. My plainness was a fact I had accepted as I had accepted the changing of the seasons. My hair was the color of autumn leaves after the glories has faded, my eyes a quiet gray that mirrored the sullen English sky, and my figure was too slender to be fashionable. I had none of Clarice's incandescent charm, her brilliant blue eyes and hair the color of spun gold. She moved through rooms like a melody, drawing all eyes and ears, while I was the silence that followed unnoticed and unremarkable. My value, I had long understood, lay in my invisibility. I arranged the flowers, mended the linens, and ensured the household accounts were in impeccable order, all so that the stage could be perfectly set for Clara's performance. And now the performance was to be for the Duke of Blackwood. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, was more of a legend than a man in our quiet corner of Hertfordshire. He was fabulously wealthy, impossibly powerful, and tragically widowed. He had inherited the title and the vast brooding estate of Blackwood Manor 5 years prior, after his elder brother had died in a riding accident, and society whispered that the Duke was a man forged from grief and duty. He was said to be severe, unsmiling, a creature of granite and shadow who had no time for the frivolities of society. His sudden decision to open Blackwood for the season and attend local functions had sent a shockwave through every drawing room and parlor, igniting the ambitions of every mother with a marriageable daughter. My stepmother was no exception. In her mind, Clara was already the Duchess. The night of the assembly, our small house was a whirlwind of panic and preparation. Clara was laced into a gown of celestial blue silk that made her look like a piece of captured sky. My stepmother fluttered around her, adjusting a curl here, a ribbon there, her face flushed with vicarious triumph. My role, as always, was functional. I had ensured the carriage was ready, that Clara's slippers were warmed, and that her reticule contained a fresh lace handkerchief. I myself still was dressed in a gown of dove-gray muslin, a dress whose primary virtue was its ability to fade into the wallpaper. My only adornment was a small, intricately carved cameo of my mother, pinned at my collar. It was my one tangible link to a time when I had been not an inconvenience, but a beloved child. The assembly hall was a glittering cacophony of light and sound. Hundreds of candles burned in the chandeliers, their light fracturing into 1,000 brilliant shards on the jewels of the dancers. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, perfume, and nervous expectation. I found a seat near the back, behind a potted fern, my preferred vantage point for observing the grand theater of society. From here, I could watch the machinations, the brittle smiles, the subtle negotiations of status and desire, without having to participate. He arrived just as the first waltz began, and a hush fell over the room, a collective intake of breath. The Duke of Blackwood was taller than I had imagined, with broad shoulders that strained the impeccable cut of his black evening coat. His hair was as dark as a raven's wing, and his face was all sharp angles and severe lines, as if carved from unforgiving stone. He did not smile. His eyes, a startlingly clear and piercing shade of blue, swept the room with an air of profound disinterest. They were the eyes of a man fulfilling an obligation, not a man seeking pleasure. My stepmother practically pushed Clara into his path, and he, with the cool automatic courtesy of his station, bowed and murmured the appropriate pleasantries. The evening progressed precisely as my stepmother had planned. The Duke danced the first set with Clara. He was a proficient, if unenthusiastic, partner, He guided her through the steps with a formal precision that lacked any warmth, his expression unchanging. Clara, for her part, glowed. She smiled and chattered, filling the silence he offered with a cascade of practiced pleasantries. I watched them from my hiding place, a strange ache in my chest. It was not jealousy, not for Clara or the Duke, but a profound and weary sense of loneliness. They were all playing parts in a well-rehearsed play, and I was the only one who seemed to know the script was a fiction. Later, I was tasked with fetching Clara a glass of lemonade. As I navigated the edge of the crowded ballroom, my mind elsewhere, I failed to notice a footman hurrying in the opposite direction. We collided. A tray of empty glasses clattered to the floor, a sharp, discordant sound that momentarily silenced the orchestra. I stumbled, my book of Marcus Aurelius, my constant companion and shield, slipping from my grasp and skidding across the polished floor. Mortification washed over me, hot and swift. I was a disruption, a clumsy shadow that had suddenly, horribly, become visible. I knelt quickly, my face burning, fumbling to gather the scattered glasses, my only thought to disappear again as quickly as possible. A dark shape blocked the candlelight. A pair of gleaming black boots stopped directly in front of me. Slowly, I looked up. It was the Duke of Blackwood. He was looking down at me, and for the first time that evening, the mask of cold indifference was gone. His expression was one of curiosity, a faint, almost imperceptible furrow in his brow. He did not offer a hand, for which I was grateful. I would surely have fumbled it. Instead, he bent down, his movements economical and precise, and picked up my book. He held it for a moment, his gloved thumb tracing the worn leather spine. He read the title, and something flickered in those intense blue eyes. It was not a glance, not the polite, dismissive sweep one gives a servant or an obstacle. It was a look, a direct, focused, and deeply unsettling appraisal that seemed to see past the gray dress and the flushed cheeks, past the social invisibility I had cultivated for so long. It was as if he had looked into a dim room and, instead of dismissing the shadows, had waited for his eyes to adjust. He held the book out to me. Meditations, he said, his voice a low baritone, deeper than I had expected. An ambitious choice for a ballroom. I took the book, my fingers brushing his glove. A strange current, like a tiny spark of static electricity, passed between us. I could not find my voice. I simply clutched the book to my chest, a drowning sailor clinging to a piece of driftwood. I managed a small, jerky nod. He did not move away. He continued to look at me, his gaze analytical. "You are Mr. Finch's other daughter," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact he had just unearthed. Before I could answer, my stepmother was there, her smile a painted rictus of horror. "Your Grace," she simpered, "pay no mind to Ilara, she is dreadfully clumsy."
"Clara is waiting for you by the terrace."
She shot me a look of pure venom, a silent command to vanish. I did. I scurried away, my heart hammering against my ribs, the weight of the Duke's gaze feeling like a physical brand on my skin. I did not see him for the rest of the evening, but I felt him. His presence was a magnetic pull on the very air in the room, and I was acutely, painfully aware of my own sudden unwelcome solidity. I had been seen, and I did not know if it was a blessing or a curse. The days that followed were stranger still. My stepmother's fury over my public gaffe was monumental, but it was quickly eclipsed by a bewildering new development. The Duke of Blackwood began to call, not on Clara, as everyone expected, but on my father. He would arrive in his severe, perfectly polished black carriage and closet himself in my father's study for an hour at a time, discussing, so my father claimed, matters of estate management and agricultural reform. It was an entirely plausible explanation, as Blackwood Manor was the largest estate in the county, and my father, for all his failings, had a decent theoretical knowledge of land husbandry. Yet it felt like a subterfuge. On his third visit, as I was arranging some late-blooming roses in the hall, he emerged from the study just as I was passing. My father and stepmother were not present. For a moment, we were entirely alone in the cool, dim hallway. "Miss Finch," he said, his voice making my name sound solid, substantial. "Your Grace," I murmured, dipping into a curtsy, my eyes fixed on the floorboards. "Your father tells me you manage the household accounts." I was startled by the directness of the question. "I do. Your Grace. You must have a formidable mind for figures," he observed. "This house, despite its age, runs with a certain efficiency." The compliment was so unexpected, so precise, that I dared to look up at him. He was watching me with that same unnerving intensity from the assembly, his gaze missing nothing. He was not speaking of the drapes or the polish on the silver. He was speaking of the underlying structure, the careful mathematics of survival that I practiced every single day. He saw the scaffolding beneath the crumbling facade. "I find numbers to be a comfort, Your Grace," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "They are logical, they do not lie." A flicker of something, was it amusement or perhaps understanding, crossed his features. "A rare quality," he said, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to the worn book I was never without, tucked into the pocket of my apron. "In people, as in ledgers." And then he was gone, leaving me standing in the hall with a racing heart and a profound sense of dislocation. He had spoken to me. He had spoken to me of my mind. In a world that had only ever valued me for my utility or dismissed me for my lack of beauty, It was a gesture so radical it felt like a seismic event. A key was turning in a lock I had not even known was there. His visits continued, and with them these small stolen moments of conversation. He would find me in the garden, where I tend my mother's roses, and ask about soil composition. He would discover me in the library, a room no one else in the family ever used, and we would speak of the Stoics, of Virgil, of the stark differences between Roman and English law. These conversations were my sustenance. They were brief, formal, and always chaperoned by the cavernous silence of the rooms we occupied, but they were real. With him, I did not feel like a shadow. I felt like a person. My stepmother was incandescent with rage and confusion. The Duke's attention was meant for Clara, the jewel of the family. His persistent, polite focus on me was an aberration, a disruption to her carefully laid plans. She began to confine me to the house, manufacturing endless tasks to keep me from his path. The mending pile grew to a mountain. The pantries required constant reorganization. She could not forbid him from the house, but she could attempt to render me invisible once more. It was then that the secret kindnesses began. One raw autumn morning, I awoke shivering in my small, drafty attic room to find a thick, woolen shawl, the color of deep heather, draped over the chair by my bed. It was of a quality we could never afford, soft and impossibly warm. There was no note, no explanation, but I knew. I knew it was from him. He had seen me shivering in the garden the day before. He had seen and he had acted. The warmth of the wool was nothing compared to the warmth that flooded my heart. A week later, a first edition of Seneca's Letters, bound in dark green leather, appeared on the library table, left in the exact spot where I always sat. Inside the cover, there was no inscription, only a single perfectly pressed oak leaf. It was a message in a language only we two understood, a continuation of a conversation we had started about resilience and the turning of the seasons. I held the book to my chest, its solid weight a reassurance, a promise. He saw me, he heard me, and he answered. The intimacy of these gestures was more profound than any public courtship. They were a silent acknowledgement of my existence, a testament to his attentiveness. He was not courting the daughter of the house. He was communicating with me, Alara, the girl in the gray dress with the sad eyes in the book of philosophy. The inevitable confrontation with my stepmother came on a Tuesday. She cornered me in the linen closet, her face a mask of fury. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her fingers digging into my arm. "What tricks are you playing?" "The Duke is meant for Clara. He is our salvation. You will not ruin this with your quiet manipulations." "I am doing nothing," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I am merely living in this house, as I always have." "You will stop," she commanded. "Whatever this is, this intellectual flirtation, it ends now. You are a nobody, Alara, a plain, penniless nobody. Do you truly believe a man like the Duke of Blackwood could have any genuine interest in you? He is amusing himself. Or worse, he is assessing our family, and you are making us look ridiculous." Her words were cruel, but they struck a chord of fear that was already present within me. Was it true? Was I a fool? Was this all some elaborate, private joke for a bored aristocrat? The doubt once planted began to grow, its thorny vines wrapping around the fragile hope that had begun to bloom in my heart. Kindness from the powerful, I knew, often came with invisible invoices. I began to pull away, making myself scarce when he called, pleading a headache or an urgent task. The light in my world dimmed, the silence returned, and it was heavier than before. The crisis arrived, as crises often do, in a sealed envelope delivered by a courier. It was addressed to my father, but my stepmother, in her usual fashion, opened it. I was polishing silver in the dining room when I heard her shriek, a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. I rushed to the drawing room to find her staring at a legal document, her face as white as bleached linen. My father was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. "We are ruined," she whispered, the letter trembling in her hand, "utterly ruined." She threw the paper onto the table. I picked it up. My eyes scanned the dense, unforgiving script. It was a formal notice from the solicitors of the Blackwood estate. It detailed a series of substantial loans my father had taken out against our property, loans that he had, for years, failed to repay. The total debt was staggering, an impossible sum. The letter stated that the Duke, as the new head of the estate, had reviewed the long-delinquent account and was now formally calling in the debt. We had 3 months to pay, or we would lose everything. The date on the first loan was over 10 years ago. The Duke's brother had been the one to grant it. But the final notice, the demand for payment, was dated last week. It was signed by Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood. A cold, sick dread washed over me, extinguishing the last embers of warmth his kindness had kindled. It was all a lie. The conversations, the books, the shawl. It was not a courtship. It was an assessment. He had been taking the measure of his investment, inspecting the property and its inhabitants before foreclosing. I was not a woman he was interested in. I was a line item in a ledger, a minor asset in a failing portfolio. My stepmother had been right. I was a fool. The pain of it was a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. It was not just disillusionment. It was the brutal erasure of a self I was just beginning to discover. The Alara who was worthy of a duke's attention, the Alara who could discuss philosophy and estate management as an equal. She had never existed. She was a ghost, a fiction I had naively allowed myself to believe in. I did not weep. My grief was a cold, hard stone in my chest. I folded the letter, placed it back on the table, and walked out of the room. I walked out of the house, my feet carrying me with a purpose I did not feel, towards the one place that felt like mine. The small, overgrown corner of the garden where my mother's roses still fought for life against the encroaching weeds. I needed to be alone to rebuild the walls around my heart that he had so effortlessly breached. He found me there. I should have known he would. His timing was always impeccable. He must have been on his way for another of his visits. He stood at the edge of the rose garden, his tall frame silhouetted against the pale afternoon sun. He was not wearing his formal riding coat, but a simpler, more practical tweed jacket. For a moment, he simply looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said. It was not a question. I did not turn to face him. I continued to stare at a rose bush, its leaves blighted with black spot. "I know that my family is in your debt," I said, my voice flat, devoid of all emotion, "and that you have come to collect." A long silence stretched between us, filled only by the rustling of the leaves and the distant cawing of a rook. "The debt is a matter between my estate and your father," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "It has nothing to do with you." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped my lips. "Has it not? Your sudden interest in our provincial society, your visits to this house, your conversations. Was it all just due diligence, your grace? Were you simply inspecting the merchandise before seizing it?" He moved then, closing the distance between us in 2 long strides. He stood beside me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the faint, clean scent of leather and winter air that clung to him. "Look at me, Alara." It was the first time he had used my given name. It should have been a moment of intimacy, but it felt like a violation, another calculated move in a game I did not understand. Reluctantly, I forced myself to meet his eyes. The cool control was gone, his face was stark, his jaw tight, and his blue eyes burned with an emotion I could not name. It looked like anger, but also something else, something that looked dangerously like pain. "The debt is a catastrophe," he said, his voice low and raw, a complication I did not discover until a month ago, when I began a full review of the estate's holdings. It was my brother's doing, a foolish act of sentiment for an old school acquaintance. When I found it, my first instinct was to handle it as I handle all business, impersonally, efficiently. "I came here to assess the situation, to meet your father, to determine the best course of action." He paused, his gaze searching my face. "That was the plan. The plan did not include you." My breath hitched. "Everything else," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming rough with feeling, "was a catastrophe I did not plan for. I did not plan to find the most intelligent, incisive, and resilient woman I have ever met hiding in the shadows of a ballroom. I did not plan for our conversations to become the only part of my day that felt real. I did not plan for your quiet strength to dismantle every defense I have spent the last 5 years building. The debt is a legal matter. You," he said, and his voice broke on the word, "are a matter of the heart." I stared at him, my mind reeling, unable to process the raw, desperate sincerity in his voice. The world had tilted again, but this time it was not a lurch into despair, but a dizzying, terrifying ascent. "The letter," I whispered, the words scratching my dry throat, "the final notice, was sent by my solicitor against my express orders," he said, his eyes flashing with fury. "An overzealous fool who believed he was acting in my best interests. I rode here today to tell your father that I am forgiving the debt entirely, and to ask you a question." He took a step closer, and this time he did take my hand. His grasp was warm and firm, his bare fingers wrapping around my cold ones. It was not the chaste, gloved touch of the ballroom. It was real, solid, a tether in the swirling storm of my emotions. "I've spent 5 years encased in ice, Alara," he confessed, his gaze holding mine captive. "Grief and duty were the only things I allowed myself to feel. I thought Blackwood, the title, the responsibility, I thought that was all I was. Then I saw you, kneeling on a ballroom floor with your fierce pride and your book of ancient wisdom, and the ice began to crack. You have unmade me. You are in my every thought. I find I cannot contemplate a future that does not have you in it." My carefully constructed walls crumbled, turning to dust in the face of his staggering, vulnerable confession. The stone of grief in my chest dissolved, replaced by a surging, overwhelming wave of hope so powerful it made me tremble. He saw me. He had always seen me. The debt was not the reason, it was the obstacle. "I do not want your gratitude," he said fiercely. "I do not want you to feel indebted to me. I want you to look at me the way you look at a passage in a book that speaks a truth you have always known but never heard before." Tears I had refused to shed now welled in my eyes, blurring his earnest face. "I think," I managed to say, my voice thick with unshed emotion, "I already do." A slow, deep, and shaking breath escaped him. It was the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time. He did not kiss me. It was not the time or place. Instead, he lifted my hand and pressed his lips to my knuckles, a gesture of profound, almost reverent respect. It was a promise, an alliance, a beginning. We stood together in the dying garden, no longer a duke and a poor relation, but a man and a woman who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. We had a battle ahead of us, I knew. My family would not surrender their ambitions easily. But for the first time in my life, I was not alone. The final battle took place, as perhaps it was always destined to, in the grand ballroom of Blackwood Manor. The Duke had insisted on hosting a ball to formally announce his return to society, and my family's invitation was, of course, a command. My stepmother had spent a fortnight in a state of supreme agitation, convinced this was the night the Duke would finally propose to Clara. She had commissioned a new gown for her, a confection of ivory and gold that cost more than our household budget for 6 months. For me, she had allowed nothing, assuming I would wear my usual gray. But Alistair, he had insisted I use his name in private, had made other arrangements. The afternoon of the ball, a dressmaker had arrived with a large box. Inside was a gown of the deepest midnight blue velvet, so dark it was almost black. It was exquisitely made but utterly unadorned, relying on its perfect cut and luxurious fabric for its beauty. With it was a small, velvet box. Inside lay a delicate silver necklace, a single sapphire hanging from the chain, the exact color of Alistair's eyes. There was a note in his strong, clear hand. So you can no longer fade into the shadows. They are my domain, and I would rather you stood in the light. When I descended the stairs, my family stared at me in stunned silence. The gown fit as if it were a second skin, the rich velvet absorbing the candlelight and giving it back as a soft, deep glow. The sapphire rested in the hollow of my throat, cool and solid. I did not look beautiful, not in the way Clara was beautiful. But I looked substantial. I felt it too. The woman who had been a shadow was gone. In her place stood someone else, someone I was only just beginning to know. My stepmother recovered first. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "It was a gift," I said calmly, meeting her gaze without flinching. Her face paled as the implication dawned on her. But before she could speak, the carriage was announced. The ride to Blackwood was silent and fraught with a tension so thick it felt difficult to breathe. The ballroom was even more magnificent than the local assembly hall. It was a vast space of white marble and gold leaf, lit by a galaxy of 1,000 candles. An orchestra played from a gilded balcony, and the floor was a swirling kaleidoscope of silks and jewels. Alistair was standing at the entrance, a formidable, solitary figure in stark black and white. His eyes found me the moment I entered the room, and a slow, private smile touched his lips, a smile I was coming to realize was reserved for me alone. He came forward, his gaze never leaving mine, and took my hand. "Alara," he said, his voice was a warm current in the sea of noise. "You are magnificent," he bowed to my stunned family. "Lady Finch. Clara, Mr. Finch." Then he turned back to me. "You will grant me the first dance, I hope." He led me onto the floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz. To dance with him was nothing like his stiff, formal dance with Clara. He held me securely, guiding me with a confidence that was both powerful and gentle. We moved as one, a silent conversation passing between us, in the steps of the dance, in the pressure of his hand on my back, in the intensity of his gaze. We did not speak. We did not need to. The entire room watched, whispering behind their fans, the truth of the situation dawning on them all at once. The Duke of Blackwood had not chosen the beautiful, charming Clara Finch. He had chosen the quiet, plain older sister. When the dance ended, he led me towards a small alcove, but we were intercepted. My stepmother, her face a terrifying mask of fury and desperation, stood before us. Clara and my father hovered behind her, looking utterly lost. "Your Grace," she said, her voice high and shrill, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. "You must not be deceived by this girl. I cannot, in good conscience, stand by and watch you fall into her trap." A shocked silence fell over our corner of the ballroom. Alistair's hand tightened on mine, a silent signal of support. He remained perfectly still, his face impassive, allowing her to play her final, desperate hand. "She is a conniving, manipulative fortune hunter," my stepmother declared, her voice rising with hysteria. "She has preyed upon your good nature, Your Grace, using her feigned meekness to weave a web of deceit. She has known influence about my husband's debt to your estate and has used that knowledge to insinuate herself into your life, to secure her own future at the expense of her own family. She is a viper we have harbored in our home." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and venomous. I felt the stares of dozens of people, felt their judgment and their morbid curiosity. The old Alara would have shrunk, would have withered under the force of such a public attack. But I was not the old Alara. I looked at my stepmother, at the woman who had spent years trying to erase me, and I felt not fear but a profound and liberating pity. I gently removed my hand from Alistair's and took a step forward. "You are mistaken, Lady Finch," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence. It did not tremble. "I learned of the debt less than a week ago, but I have known for my entire life that, in your eyes, a woman's only value lies in the quality of the match she can secure. You are not angry because you believe I have deceived the Duke. You are angry because I have secured him." A collective gasp went through the assembled crowd. "The only deception here," I continued, my gaze unwavering, "is the one you have perpetrated for years, that a quiet mind is an empty one, that a plain face denotes a worthless character, and that my sister's happiness could only be purchased with my erasure. I am not a viper. I am simply a woman who's finally found someone who does not require her to be anything other than what she is. My stepmother was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Her plan had backfired spectacularly. She had expected me to crumble, to weep, to prove her accusations through my own weakness. She had not expected me to stand and fight back with the truth. It was then that Alistair moved. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His presence alone commanded the room. Lady Finch, he began, his voice laced with ice. Your accusations are not only baseless, they are a slander against the woman I intend to make my wife. Another louder gasp. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. This is a legal instrument executed by my solicitors this morning. It cancels, in its entirety, the debt owed by your husband to my estate. I have done this not for him, nor for you, but for Alara, to ensure that she comes to our marriage entirely free, without any sense of obligation. The only trap here tonight, madam, is the one you have set for yourself. He let the words hang in the air, a final damning verdict. The social ruin was instant and absolute. The whispers started, the averted eyes, the subtle shifting of people moving away from my family as if they were carriers of a plague. My stepmother's face crumpled, the mask of rage replaced by the stark, ugly face of defeat. My father simply stared at the floor, a broken man. Even Clara looked at me with a new, strange expression, not of anger, but of dawning, reluctant respect. Alistair took my hand again. Come, he said softly. Let us leave them to their reckoning. He led me from the ballroom, away from the prying eyes and the dying whispers, out onto a stone terrace that overlooked the moonlit gardens of his home. The night air was cool and clean. The sound of the orchestra was a faint, distant murmur. Below us, the formal gardens lay sleeping under a blanket of silver light. For a long time, we stood in silence, simply breathing. The tension of the last few weeks, the last few years, the last lifetime, seemed to drain out of me, leaving behind a quiet, peaceful emptiness. Are you all right? He asked, his voice gentle. I am, I said, and I was surprised to find that it was true. I feel light. He turned to face me, his hands coming up to cup my face. His thumbs traced the line of my jaw, his touch infinitely tender. What you did in there, he said, his voice thick with emotion, was the bravest thing I have ever seen. I only spoke the truth, I whispered. Truth is the rarest and most courageous commodity of all, he replied. As are you, Alara Finch. His eyes searched mine, and in their depths, I saw everything he had confessed and more. I saw respect, I saw admiration. I saw a profound and abiding love that mirrored the one that had taken root in my own heart. You said, I began, my heart beating a rapid, hopeful rhythm, that you intended to make me your wife. I do, he said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. If you will have me, if you will consent to fill the quiet rooms of this house, and the even quieter rooms of my heart, with your presence. If you will be my partner, my Duchess, my friend, my Alara. The tears I'd held back for so long finally fell, tracing silent paths down my cheek. They were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so vast and overwhelming it could not be contained. Yes, I breathed. Yes, Alistair, I will. And then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of polite society, nor one of fierce, unrestrained passion. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was slow and deep and shaking with all the unsaid words, all the secret kindnesses, all the quiet moments of understanding that had led us to this terrace. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, that healed a wound, that began a future. In his arms, under the silent, watching moon, I was no longer the shadow, the marginalia, the inconvenience. I was seen, I was known, I was home. 6 months later, I stood in the great library of Blackwood Manor, now my library, running my hand along the spines of the thousands of books that were now our books. The autumn sun streamed through the tall arched windows, casting long golden ribbons of light across the room. Alistair came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood like that for a moment, watching the dust motes dance in the sunbeams. My family had retreated to a small cottage in the north. The dowry Alistair had settled on Clara, ensuring she would not be entirely without prospects. My stepmother's social ambitions were shattered, but in a letter I had received from Clara, there was a surprising note of peace. We are quiet here, she had written. For the first time, I think, we are simply ourselves. Perhaps even they had found a sort of freedom in their downfall. What are you thinking about? Alistair murmured, his breath warm against my ear. I leaned back against him, my heart full. I thought of the girl in the gray dress, hiding behind a potted fern. I thought of the woman who had believed her life was to be a postscript in someone else's story. They seemed like people from a distant past, characters in a book I had read long ago. I was thinking, I said softly, turning in his arms to face him, about a passage in Marcus Aurelius. The universe is transformation. Our life is what our thoughts make it. A slow smile spread across his face, the beautiful, rare smile that was mine alone. And what are your thoughts making of our life now, Your Grace? He teased. I reached up and touched his face, the face I now knew as well as my own. That I did not know a life could hold this much light, I confessed. That I have been transformed, that I am finally, truly home. He bent his head and kissed me, a soft, familiar kiss full of quiet contentment and the promise of 1,000 more days just like this one, filled with books and light, and a love that had found its voice in the silence.